Okay.
Hi everyone.
Good
So
morning.
I'll just do introduction,
Penny.
if that's all right. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Disaster Legal Assistance, What to Expect in Response and Recovery Phases. My name's Penny Sullivan. I'm one of the Sector Sustainability Coordinators at Community Legal Centres Queensland. So we'd like to kick off firstly with our acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land on which we are holding today's webinar. In Meanjin, Brisbane, they are the Turrbal and the Yagara people. We pay our deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging. As this webinar is being viewed by people across Queensland and Australia, we also pay respect to the traditional owners throughout the country. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of the lands in Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. We acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and commit to fostering a culture of learning from and working with First Nations peoples in the spirit of reconciliation and access to justice. We extend a warm welcome to any First Nations people listening today. So this morning we're really pleased to welcome Bill Mitchell, Principal Solicitor at Townsville Community Law, who will be discussing practical issues that arise for the legal assistance sector in responding to the recent floods disaster. Bill has been involved in providing a disaster legal response since the 1990s, including iterations of cyclone and flood legal help, and he was instrumental in drafting a report published last year on disaster readiness for the legal assistance sector in Queensland, and we've made that report available on our website as well. I'll let Bill tell you a bit more about himself when I hand over in a moment. But before I do that, just some quick housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded and we'll have that recording available to download later today or tomorrow, and I'll send out the link for that. A link for the PowerPoints and the disaster readiness report has been emailed out to everyone who registered, and they can both be downloaded from our website. They're also available from the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. We do encourage you to ask questions. There'll be time for questions at the end. So you can type your question into the question box on the control panel and we'll read your question out. As I said, we'll hold them till the end of the presentation, but do feel free to type them in as you think of them. So I'll now hand over to Bill and I'll talk to you again at the end of the session. Thanks so much, Bill.
Thanks, Penny. Thanks for the introduction. Can I also pay my respects to the Woolgoorukaba and Bindal peoples on whose land I come to you from today. Can I also acknowledge the inevitable trauma associated with disasters that many people that either involved in this webinar or who you serve will have experienced in recent weeks. It was certainly very difficult for us in North Queensland to watch it unfold, of course, not only because of our previous experiences only a few short years ago, but also given we have friends and family in all those places that were affected, certainly myself, friends and family in Brisbane, the Northern Rivers and Sydney. So there's lots of views about how to do what we're going to talk about today. And really what I'd like to start off by saying is that this is my views based on the time I've spent at Townsville Community Law, assisting people with a range of disaster issues, but most of these comments today will be based in and around the issue of immediate response and recovery. And there is a much bigger piece that ought to be done. And if you have a look at the Disaster Legal Assistance Report, you'll see that that is Townsville Community Law and others have proposed a much more heavy approach to preparedness. So by the time we get to this stage, in fact, we know what we're doing, we have a plan in place and we can operate in a way that is much more effective. And one of the things I'm going to emphasise today is the importance of equity in this response. It's something that is often raised in the literature, that disaster legal responses are often inequitable responses, and we'll talk a bit about why that is so. So I'm going to look firstly at the big picture, and there's some discussion points there. We'll touch on what the disaster cycles and phases are, but more about how people are feeling about that point in time. We will look at the equity of approach, and we'll look at what is a human rights approach to disaster assistance, more broadly than legal assistance, but I think it's adaptable. We're going to look at this potential for systemic remedies very briefly, but it's something I'd urge you to go away and think about, because it's something that hasn't really happened here, but it is akin to the work that's done in climate justice, where in fact communities will hold governments accountable for their failures through human rights and other mechanisms. So we'll touch on that briefly. I'm going to talk briefly about this idea of surge capacity, which is really the ability to come up to speed, or services come up to speed with the needs of the community at the time of and after disasters. And we'll talk a bit about the recovery centre model, because it is one that has quite varied effectiveness in my view. In some places it's proven to be very good, in other places not so good. So we'll talk about that. After we've spoken about the big picture, we'll look more down at the local level and have a bit of a discussion about some of the key principles. I'm not going to get to the brass tacks of you're going to see this person come through your door about this. It's going to be a higher level than that, because so much of what we've learned in this disaster project is that locality is everything, and we can't be prescriptive, nor should we be assumptive about what we expect to see. Unfortunately, this is the recovery trajectory for communities. So I think we're probably at the moment somewhere between the honeymoon phase and disappointment and anger. Although, as you will have seen, communities are affected very differently by disaster. And so some communities, no doubt places in Brisbane where suburbs have managed to clean up, they're in the process perhaps of having insurance quotes done, or people of getting on with their lives, whichever sorts of issues are impacting on them, maybe having this sense of shared survival, and in fact they haven't gotten to anything further. Whereas I think we've very clearly seen that communities in the Northern Rivers are very much still in a phase of being very angry, and in fact they're still on the front line of the disaster itself. They haven't quite pushed through into, I would say, recovery phase. And so this is possibly the most important thing that we need to understand in serving a community affected by disaster, is that there are very well-known phases. Quite aside from the disaster phase, this is the recovery trajectory. And communities will reach these phases or these points in time at different times. And so I'll emphasise a couple of times throughout the presentation just how important timing is. And that timing does need to align with people's emotional states and their readiness to do the things that they need to do. One of the perplexing things that we notice over time in our service is that often people have immediate needs, but they're not ready to deal with them, even though we present them with a set of options. They're not quite ready. And this is because people experiencing disaster have experienced a trauma, they're suffering from grief. So all of the interplaying factors that people experience in trauma and in grief are weighing on them. And so we need to be very clear about letting people drive the relationship between us and them. We need to be very client-centered. And this gives you a sense, this recovery trajectory gives you a sense of where they're at through that process themselves. Just bear with my voice a little. I'm on day one of coming out of ISO after having had COVID, so I'm still getting there. We are really talking about response phase, and that covers two distinct phases. I'll just leave them on the screen for a moment. We're talking about the immediate post-disaster response, which in most places I would say has already occurred. And then immediately after that, we have this short-term response, which leads into recovery. This is a transition phase where communities are cleaning up, they're identifying immediate needs, they're identifying the damage and loss that's been caused, but they haven't yet dealt with the day-to-day living necessities. So some people are still looking for somewhere to live, some people are still trying to get income or money, some people are still dealing with the broken objects in their lives, whether that's the furniture or the family, and others are still in the daze, frankly. So we're in a kind of twilight period at the moment for some communities. Others have moved on, as I said, and only you within your own community can determine where people are at by talking to them. So you will only know where people are at by getting out there and actually seeing people with these issues. But just be aware that the response phase is not a long phase, but it's one that has a number of different aspects. But it is in reality where people move into recovery. And so I would dare say that some communities are not there yet, but they are probably getting close. In terms of community response, it is important to understand that there are 4 major domains that government and disaster governance and frameworks are focused on. That includes the built environment, the natural environment, the economic environment, and finally, but most importantly for us, the social environment. And really, communities' aspect of social environment is the one that we focus on in the work that we do. It's the area that we are most interested in, which is about restoring people's positions across a wide range of areas, including their positions of family. They may have issues arising from disasters that are related to family violence or family law. It could be the loss of property. It could be the loss of employment or income. It could be the loss of self-confidence and psychological well-being. So this is the area that we're most interested in. That's not to say that there aren't other things that will impact on us. There certainly are. And for our clients and for our own centres, we may have issues with our own built environment, and we may have issues with the economic environment. But the work that we are doing is focused on the social environmental aspects of community recovery. The other thing I wanted to show you is that the recovery cycle is also very important. As you can see, we have a disaster, we move into that response phase, and then that, as I said, that transitions into the provision of relief and short-term recovery. And then really this next phase, long-term recovery, is where the work begins and the real work for legal assistance begins, I would say. There are very different things that occur in these phases, and we'll have a bit of a chat about that later. But again, I don't like to be prescriptive about this, because what happens in communities will vary entirely upon their demographics, their socioeconomic status, where they are placed, and what sort of impacts they had. But just be aware that we are in a cycle, that disasters occur in a cycle, a climatic cycle, and our response to disasters echoes that cycle in a way that starts with response and relief, short-term recovery, and then for us, most importantly, long-term recovery. The publication that you've got sent to you really looks at how we prepare ourselves in recovery planning and in being aware of all these elements. There is a very strong argument, in fact, I think it's a fait accompli really, that we should be understanding the disaster legal needs of our community so much better than we do. There hasn't ever been a full-scale disaster legal needs analysis done. We should be using those disaster legal needs to plan at a local level and a state level. And so by the time we have a disaster, we know what to do, we know where to go, we know what will happen. So we're not there yet, but please have a read of the publication, have a look at the model that's proposing. It's only one model, it's not the only model out there, but it's one model that we've developed, which matches for us very closely with our model of disaster governance and our model of legal assistance forums. But at this stage, we're in that bottom right, whatever that object is called. I'm not sure. It's a kite, really, isn't it, when you look at it? We're in that relief and short-term recovery phase. But we will be moving into long-term recovery, soonish, and that's really where the work is. If you're involved or going to be involved in disaster legal work, I think it's really important to have a look at the Bushfire Royal Commission's final report. Now, while this is really specified to be about the bushfires, it of course did try and deal with disaster readiness and resilience from a much broader perspective. In fact, from the perspective of natural disasters more generally. Of course, some places like the southeast can experience floods, bushfires and cyclones, whereas up here where I am, we're more likely to experience monsoonal weather, which causes floods and cyclones. So the Royal Commission does in fact attempt to address each of the different types of natural disasters. The Commission's very clear that recovery is a very complex and personal process. And this really does support what I'm saying about not being too prescriptive or assumptive about what will happen, really understanding that recovery occurs at an individual, a neighbourhood, a community, and a town or city level. It's multi-layered, it involves a range of unique social and developmental processes, and it has to actually address the diverse needs of a range of individuals. And this is a key point for us, is we need to be thinking about in all of this, who are our diverse individuals and what are their needs? Of course, recovery also provides hope and a sense of future, and it allows us to prepare for future disasters. Much of the work that's done in national disaster governance is based around what's called the Sendai framework, and it's really focused on making sure that resilience is the principal focus of governments, because it's one thing to have in place bulwarks against disasters. It's another thing entirely to ensure that your community are actually prepared and can bounce back, or as in the words of Sendai, build back better. So really, we should also be thinking very seriously about what can we do to add value to the resilience movement? How can we ensure the resilience of our discrete communities of interest? Recovery processes have to understand the context of the community, which are complex and dynamic. The communities themselves are just as complex and dynamic as the disasters that impact on them. It's very important to use community-led approaches. This is a case where we have a unique mixture of top-down and bottom-up management, and they both have their place. Of course, disaster governance operates much more in a top-down approach. However, we are already seeing the signs from this current disaster that responses need to be led from a local approach. And the communities that are saying, despite all of the work and all of the money and all of the understanding that we have reached about disaster, we are still seeing local communities that did not have an effective response. So it's incredibly important that we ourselves, who are based within community and understand and treasure that connection, lead those sorts of responses and don't be distracted by other types of approaches. Having said that, you will need to be planned, coordinated, and you'll need to adapt your approach. And that really all needs to be around the needs of the community. The primary focus of disaster management is good communication, and this is critical. And if you read any of the reviews or evaluations done of disaster assistance of any kind, anywhere in Australia, they will all come back to the key importance of good and effective communications, both with communities affected and with the stakeholders. Can't emphasise that enough, and we'll talk a bit about that towards the end. You know, this idea of resilience really is critical, and I put a cautionary word out there to everyone on this webinar that in the past we have been really open to assisting whoever is impacted by disaster. It's been the one situation in which we have presumed that the importance of each individual client's needs transcend the sorts of priorities we would otherwise place on their interests. So, for example, we have been generally happy to assist people with greater means in this situation than we would otherwise undertake. We do need to be very cautious about this, because the scale of disasters will mean that you have more attention from those who have means, but we need to be aware that the effects of natural disasters are far greater on people living in poverty or who are more vulnerable. And so this paradoxical situation where those who are most likely to seek help are those that least need it, those least likely to seek help are those that most need it. So be aware of this paradox, and that you should not be feeding it. You really need to be making sure that any offering of services is equity oriented. A biased recovery service allocation is a post-disaster recovery barrier. It's that simple. So please be thinking about this as you're planning your disaster response, and be keeping an eye on this throughout your work over the recovery period. This is not just an idea of mine or the literature I've taken those principles from. It is, of course, the position of the United Nations in its draft articles on the protection of persons in the event of disasters, which says that we need to ensure that the principles of humanity, neutrality and impartiality are tempered by non-discrimination and taking into account the needs of the particularly vulnerable. So it is very important that we ensure that our response take place in a way that is all of those things there, but of course, predominantly in respect of the needs of the particularly vulnerable. This is reinforced by the Brookings-Burns project, which says the 4 key areas for human rights protection are those ones on the screen: life, security and physical and mental and moral integrity, necessities of life, economic, social and cultural rights, and civil and political rights. I mean, I know that encompasses everything, but we need to be thinking about our approach through the human rights lens. And it does give us a very clear way of looking at who should get services. It's a way of prioritising what are the human rights impacted. So, for example, for a person with considerable wealth who has lost a property, of course, their property rights have been impacted. That's a human right. It's a human right that exists in our own Human Rights Act. But we need to ask ourselves, how would we prioritise that case against someone who has, in fact, lost their home entirely because of their eviction from rental premises? So we need to be able to balance cases that look similar, and in fact, sometimes cases that look more significant because of the quantum of money or the quantum of issue involved, and really look at those with a bit more deeper insight and say, well, actually, what are the human rights that are engaged? A successful disaster response is most definitely one that places the rights of humans at the centre. I'm not going to dwell on this because this is what I spoke of earlier about systemic remedies, but increasingly international jurisprudence does reveal that communities can seek remedies. And so if you follow that case there, the case against Turkey, you will find that there are a range of cases where communities have taken legal action against their governments on the basis of their failings to protect their human rights, including, of course, most importantly, the right to life, but other human rights as well. So just bear in mind that we may have some application, more formal application under human rights law, and we should always be thinking about how we can use the Act to not only ensure the breadth of human rights are protected, but that human rights themselves are used most effectively wherever possible. This idea of surge capacity is really important, but the ultimate question is, can you do it? So do you have the ability to upscale your services at a time when you, in fact, may be affected by the disaster itself? You need to look at internal opportunities and external opportunities. And I think it's very important that services apply for contingency funds to make sure they have someone to do this, because it isn't just a part-time job for a few months. Our flood legal service last time operated with a full-time lawyer for 18 months. I think the services was well in excess of 1,000 services to the community. And the nature of people's experience means they need someone who's going to be there for a substantial amount of time. There is a tailing off at about 18 months, but having said that, there will still be people experiencing significant legal issues well afterwards. The review, an article written by the principal lawyer at Southern Louisiana Community Legal Services, noted that they were still seeing the impacts of Hurricane Katrina on their clients for a decade. And so we do need to understand that the resilience issue will keep rolling on for our most disadvantaged clients. And so we do need to be in it for longer rather than a shorter period. But there's plenty of opportunities to boost your surge capacity, whether in advance or afterwards. But you know, there's all sorts of ways that we can do it internally and externally. So start thinking about those things if you haven't already. Now, the recovery centre model is one that has been used widely in Queensland, and we've used it ourselves. And this means that you go to the recovery centre, and those needing assistance will will come and seek it there. This is a bit like what I would call the Kevin Costner Field of Dreams mentality. Build it and they will come. Unfortunately, this isn't the case at all times. And in fact, the Royal Commission found that this model can be flawed. It can work. It can work, and that depends on how flexible that centre model is. I certainly don't discount people using this as a part of their outreach, but be aware that sometimes the numbers coming into recovery centres will not only be a specific cohort, but they will also be low at times. So just be aware that this model does have some limitations. Okay, let's talk about the local picture. I'm really drawn on what the Bushfire Royal Commission has said and what we found ourselves that works on the ground. It's very important that you have an accessible location, and that can mean a community resource centre, but it also means going to places where the people are. For example, insurance council events, community events where people have Q&As, events held by local members. You really need to be out there among people who've experienced loss during the event to make a connection with them. This means you need to be mobile, and you may need to work outside normal operating hours. Certainly, all of the events that we attended, community expos, disaster expos, ICA events, these all happen after hours, whether at weeknights or on weekends. And that's a feature of how communities come together in this situation. Often it's outside our ordinary operating hours. So you need to get your head around how you're going to deal with that. Find out what self-mobilised community responses have occurred within your area, and that might be through a neighbourhood centre, it might be through a online group, it could be through a local member's office. These are often the most useful points of understanding what's going on and getting referrals. You do need to be very accessible and need to have accessible information and communications. And it's very helpful, I think, to have a single point of contact or one front door. This is certainly something that Bushfire Legal Help and others have discovered. At this stage for us, this might be difficult, but certainly the fewer phone calls that people need to make, the better. As we know that when people are in trauma, they tend to fly off the referral roundabout very easily. It's also very comforting to people to understand that they will have more than a single advice from you. This is the time that if people fit your criteria based on priorities and needs, and I mean both legal and financial needs, that you make sure they understand that you are going to be involved for some time. They will lose faith very quickly in services that are point in time and, as they see, limited, and you will very quickly find yourselves in the basket of services that don't care. Legal needs are going to vary by location, demography, and themes, but you can use local data and you can use local agencies to get some sense. You can contact local members to find out what sort of complaints they're hearing about. You can contact NDIS providers to hear if people with disabilities or older persons are experiencing any particular issues based on cohorts such as nursing homes or group homes. You can contact women's services to see if there's a need for increased work in the area of intimate partner violence or family violence. There are many different legal issues which will arise, but you need to be quite clear about the differentiation between them. There will be issues that are directly linked to the event themselves, and that is person A lost X property or something like that. There are, of course, then legal issues that are indirectly linked but are exacerbated, revealed, or amplified by the event. And this includes all forms of interpersonal violence. They are the ones that also are resilience issues, and it's very important that you keep your focus on them as much as possible. Where a disaster reveals one of those interpersonal violence issues, that really is a red flag for you that client needs your assistance across a wider range of services than just what has manifested through the disaster. And also the sorts of legal issues that people need for avoiding future loss during a disaster. This is about the resilience of individuals. We see time and time again that people who are living in poverty did not have resilience in one natural disaster, that means that they suffered a loss from which they never bounced back, and they became more vulnerable to the next one. And so this cascading and cumulative disadvantage is very much obvious in people who are living in poverty in disaster-prone areas. It may be less obvious to you if you're not seeing disasters. For us, the cycle is every 2 to 3 years. So we see often the same clients, unfortunately, who are worse off down the track. Paul Holmes, who most of you might know from Legal Aid Queensland, put up a fantastic piece of advice on LinkedIn. He said that it's very important to remember that no two people have the same experience, and likewise, no two people have the same experience as they recover. Different levels of trauma, different readiness to seek help, some people not yet ready to seek help, the accessibility of help in their area, and this recovery journey being quite different in a temporal sense. People don't fit predetermined molds as they recover, and you need to adapt your supports. This is often where pro bono providers find it difficult because they have an interest in getting involved immediately, but that may not be the time that people need it. So you need to think about what services are needed at what time. This really feeds into the notion of service delivery. Please think about your existing vulnerable clients who might have been affected. You already have a relationship with them. There is absolutely nothing stopping you touching base with them and saying, look, I thought I'd just give you a call to see if you're okay. We certainly did that with our older clients during the monsoon event, and this is critically important. You've already built this rapport with these people. Check in on them. You will need to be all those things: accessible, scalable, equitable, client-centered, but these are things that you already have experience in. It's really about adapting those skills and that context to this new area. As I said, timing is everything. Specialization is important, but it's not critical. Engagement with clients is critical because, as we know, it's very easy for us to find other services for people to get assistance from. And so having specialist knowledge yourself is less important than engaging with a client and directing them somewhere that does have specialist knowledge. This is a kind of fear factor for many people who are dipping their toes in this. Sorry about the pun. But it's not critical. As I said, engagement is critical. Refer, and there will be specialist mental health services available for people who experience this. They will need them. And our experience has been that they will actually embrace these services and they will help them not only recover, but become more resilient. We already know these barriers. I'm not going to harp on them too much, but of course, repetition of multiple agencies is traumatizing. People will have engagement fatigue. They will have a whole range of assumptions about themselves, about what they're eligible for, which may or may not be correct. And they may, in some circumstances, have problems with documents, problems with identification, problems with just getting stuff done. They may not have access to a computer. They may not have access to, the sorts of things that we take for granted when people are having stable and uninterrupted lives. My final slide is about social media. It is really critically important. What we have learned is that this is probably the most important place to find, or I should say, this is the most important place for people in finding help, both good and bad advice about where they can seek help. But this is the place that people turn to when they have, both during and after disasters. There will be innumerable chat groups set up for neighbourhoods, for streets, for places, for issues. It's important to be scanning this world all the time. It's very important for local-based data and trends. You can certainly understand what is happening in your suburb or the suburb you serve by seeing what people from that suburb are saying in the Facebook group. It's a time when people will come together, share information, share experience, and for us, share data and trends. It's also the source of very useful information, including evidence around definitional refusals in insurance work, but really more about that, more about the impacts of the disaster on particular places and communities. It's also the best place for you to advertise and promote communications about the services that you are offering. It will give you, I think, a greater uptake of information, and certainly I can't think of a communications piece that would be more important than this at this stage in terms of its potential reach and really in terms of the affected populace as well. It's not going to reach everybody, of course, but it will reach quite a few. And I think that's all I had in my presentation. So perhaps I'll stop sharing my screen.
Oh, that's fine, Bill. You can keep sharing. It's Penny here. You can just
okay, sure.
Yeah, just keep sharing your screen. That's fine.
Yeah, sure.
So thank you so much for that. I found that just so interesting, and your depth of experience and knowledge in this area just comes through so clearly. So I'd invite people to start popping some questions into the chat that we can then share with Bill. And while people are reflecting on what it is they'd like to ask, I have a couple of questions for you that I thought might be interesting to explore a bit more. I was really interested in your discussion around the concept of the single point of contact. And then also the linkages then with people's levels of engagement fatigue. And I wondered if you might have some thoughts about how services can work to build their network so that people can actually come through one front door. So obviously there's going to be organisations that are already connected in their service network, but how do you kind of, as a CLC, I guess, build that so that people we can perhaps minimise those levels of engagement fatigue and multiple referrals?
Yeah, look, I think the first point is that it probably the single front door is an ideal, possibly not a reality, but certainly there will be lots of single front doors, and those single front doors will tend to be either geographic or demographically based. So I think it's important to understand where people are going for help. I mean, for our sector, of course, something like CLCQ might be a single front door, but of course there are resourcing issues. There's always resourcing issues with these things. But for a centre within a neighbourhood or within an area, their single front door might well be the local neighbourhood centre. The trick with engagement fatigue is that we certainly saw that many people who had serious issues just slipped away, and we would need to pursue them to make sure that they saw us, because they were truly fatigued. They really are focused on getting back to their lives, and people make very quick judgments, as we already know, about your level about the ability to help them. This is very similar to working in family law. People are very quick to identify just how far you're prepared to go and how much assistance they think they're going to get, and they'll walk based on that. So, yeah, it's a great question, not an easy one to answer, but I would say you need to be thinking about what that front door is for your community, and that's about tapping into those community-led responses. There are many iterations of that, but of course, depending on the suburb you're in. I mean, I don't know if there's, we're not going to be worrying about the Chelmer neighbourhood centre, I'm guessing. Well, that might be fair to anyone from Chelmer on the link up, but I'm guessing that the Logan area, we probably know who the key agencies are. If you're unsure, every local area has a disaster management group, and you only need to find out who the local disaster management group is. Now, this is a statutory model which uses localities or local government areas to have its own local disaster management group, and you can use that local disaster management group as a point of interest and a point of contact. That will generally also sponsor the local recovery group. So they're the people you really want to be talking to, the reps from the local recovery group for your locality, and finding out where is business being done. That may be through a community recovery centre, it may be through a neighbourhood centre, it may be through an organisation that you already have an outreach arrangement with, even better if that's the case. Of course, use your own existing outreach arrangements to find out whether they have particular needs, because you've already decided to go there because you think that they have a necessary prioritisation. So again, don't be forgetting your existing clients in terms of that you are the single front door for them, and there may be quite some of them. So sorry, that probably doesn't answer every part of the question, Penny, but
No, that's exactly, I think that was exactly sort of the discussion that I thought might be helpful for people to have, and actually ties in with the question that we've had come through from Katrina, who's said a fantastic presentation, by the way. Thanks, Bill. She's
Thanks.
CLC is not in a disaster area, and she's interested to know how can other CLCs help the centres in those areas. So I think it's similar, like it really kind of an aspect of what you've already been speaking about, but I suppose particularly what is it that CLCs who are outside the disaster zone can be doing to help their colleagues?
I mean, this is something that we talked about in the report, and really this is a fantastic question. We propose that there should be partnering between centres to ensure that when disasters occurred, that surge capacity would include our colleagues in other places, lifting their game to get involved. Because I think there's a simple humanity involved here where we all want to do something that's helpful. This is a really important way that we can help. Now, this is something for boards of governance to have a think about, but if you are adjacent to an area that's experienced disaster and you know that the centre there may not have expertise in an area that you do, or may not have the ability to see as many clients, then I think a collegiate approach from board to board in these times would be entirely appropriate, or from whatever level is appropriate in your case. And I certainly think it's entirely appropriate to be seeing if you can help out. That might be taking the heat off their general areas of law for a time. For example, it might be dealing with some of the regular demand areas, so they can focus on those more disaster-linked things. There's any number of ways this can happen. It's really, I don't want to limit it by my kind of a bit foggy COVID imagination today. I think the sky's the limit. I think the sky's the limit for collaboration within our sector. So I think reach out and see what happens is the way to go. But definitely a great question.
I think that's great advice, Bill. I was just going to say that sort of reach out and see how you go. See what help people think they need. We've had another question. Thank you very much for that answer. I'm sure it's been really helpful for Katrina. And the questions come through from Holly. Do you have an opinion on, and or is there literature to indicate what legal services are most useful in the preparedness / preventative stages? That is time and resources best spent providing one-on-one advice or CLE? The same question probably applies to relief and recovery, but appreciate the need for one-to-one advice is greater in those phases. Thanks.
Look, I mean, yes, I do have an opinion about this, and it's mostly in the report that I've written. So that does give you some sense, although that's at a very high level, more about how we might organise ourselves around a model of preparation. If I can answer this by giving one example that I came across, and I came across many very interesting examples during the report. The California wildfires, I think about 5 years ago, although they occur regularly, the Bar Association in California was trying to galvanise work around how they would use a very large amount of pro bono interest in the work for California wildfire legal assistance. Most of the pro bono sector's expertise was not in areas that were needed in that absolute response phase. But what they found was that, in fact, the pro bono collective was able to do enduring documents and wills and other important documents for a bunch of first responders who were low income. And so they were able to make sure that all these first responders who were nurses, paramedics, volunteer firefighters, all these sorts of people all had powers of attorney and wills and other protective legal documents, given that they were putting themselves in the face of danger. Now, this has also turned into a very similar program for COVID response first offenders. COVID, did I say offence? I'm not sure what I said. For COVID first offenders, sorry, first responders. So it's about finding the right fit at the right time. There's a huge amount of work to be done around building resilience, around understanding how to be legally prepared for disaster, yes. And I would definitely think that some of the work done around bushfires is very useful, around making sure people have got copies of certified identification, making sure they've got certain procedures in place. Yes, that's all work we can do. But until we take a planned approach, yeah, we're just not going to get to this stuff. Understanding the legal needs of communities, I think, is the first step. And if you look in the report, you'll see that we've created a diagram that shows how that model can follow the disaster cycle itself.
Terrific. Thanks, Bill. I have, there's no more questions coming through from the audience, but I do have another one that I thought we'd do a bit of time. So one of the things I think that may be challenging for some of our centres is that we do have some of our CLCs who work from really an advice-based model. So they're not really doing much in the way of ongoing casework or representative work. If there are CLCs in that situation dealing with sort of disaster scenarios, I'm mindful that you said that people really do need to have a sense that you're there and can continue to help them over time.
Yep.
Do you have some advice or thoughts for centres who might be working primarily from that advice model about how they might best help people who survive disasters?
Yeah, I think we've all been very good at times of using advice clinic and advice services to ensure that people get a bunch of discrete tasks attended to. So I think being open to adapting your limitations to the client group is important. And even the simple approach of encouraging people to come back for further advice at each step of the way is important. Maybe talking to boards about whether if you're finding clients who need more work done, whether that can be discussed around using advice appointments to further people's discrete tasks that are needed. But yeah, this is a limitation that I guess that I ultimately believe this is a self-imposed limitation that ought to be flexible enough to adapt to people's changing needs. And of course, this will depend on the needs of particular clients, but I would think that sometimes you'll find clients in this situation who just, they really need for us to drop other bits and pieces of what we're doing, hopefully picked up by someone else, so we can spend a bit more time on it than we would ordinarily have for an advice appointment. Certainly, if people only think they can get advice, then that will limit their interest in your service, because advice is good, but it's not the whole picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was an interesting aspect to explore, and I think that's where the partnering with other CLCs and within the network becomes even more important, doesn't it? So
can I just give a plug to Law Right in this regard? We have always found Law Right to be a fantastic partner. Well, they've always been very supportive of our centre in terms of finding connections for us, but even more so in these times, because they are very well set to make connections between you, your clients, and those that can either give more expertise or give more time. So really, this is the time that they come into their own. I don't make it sound like they're not doing that all the time. They are, but this is a really important time to use connections like Law Right, to use connections you have with university clinics, to use connections you have with Law Society members or informal pro bono arrangements. This really is the time to make sure you're up sort of using surge capacity within whatever your own opportunities are. So yeah, anything goes. I think don't be afraid to ask. People will say yes at this time because they want to help. They may not say yes in 6 months' time, when the corporate memory of the disaster has kind of gone, because those of us that have been able to recover well because we're well off, or we don't have other intersecting points of disadvantage bearing down on us all the time, we've moved on. But those communities that are vulnerable won't have. But if you ask too late, then they won't be able to see that we're still in disaster. They will want to move on for their own mental well-being, but that doesn't mean others haven't. So it's critically important to galvanise what you can now, and then work out how it can be best adapted based on the timing and needs of the clients. Sorry, that sounded very abstract, but I guess it's a short way of saying ask now, because later on people might have kind of forgotten about the importance of it.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, Bill. It's really that, be on the front foot, be creative, don't be afraid to ask. I think that's a really great message for people to hear at this time. So look, that's all the questions that we've had coming through. Bill, was there any sort of, I guess, summarising thoughts you'd like to leave us with before we finish off?
Yeah, look, I think something that occurred to us in our project, and something that I think we need to be very aware of, is that there are communities that simply don't benefit from mainstream disaster recovery and resilience processes. We need to be very aware of First Nations communities and not having an equal share of recovery, and we need to be quite attendant to those communities if they're near us or we normally serve them. And also people who are living in forms of institutional care are also often forgotten in this, and it is a time that people who are living in group homes or in nursing homes will be ignored by many others because the people that they would normally see don't have time for them themselves. So just think about who's vulnerable in your community, who you normally see, who may have had a double or triple disadvantage in this situation, and they really should be the ones that we are. They're not going to come and knock on your door. You'll need to make steps to go and find them, to service them. So it's important to be always thinking about that equitable approach and the human rights lens. That'd be my takeaway.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Bill. I think that's a really great summary and some great thoughts to leave people with, and a bit of a call to action. So thank you so much for that, for your time and your expertise, your generosity with your time this morning, particularly when you've been a bit under the weather, and just the depth of your knowledge and experience in this space really shines through. So thank you to our audience members for your questions as well. We appreciate everybody's time this morning. Before everyone goes, just a reminder that you can complete the feedback survey that will pop up on your screen once the webinar is closed, so your feedback does help us to continually improve our program. Don't forget also that we're running a series of webinars focused on flood and disaster responses, so do keep an eye out for that, and jump on again if there's another webinar that you're able to join us for, and we'll hopefully look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much again. Have a great day.
Thanks.